This week, we again have a parsha, which is a double portion. The last two Torah portions of the book of Vayikra, Leviticus, the third book of the 5 books of Moses. The first parsha is called Parshat Bahar, which literally means by the mountain, Bahar Sinai, by the mountain of Sinai. And the second Torah portion is called Bechukosai, which means in my laws. Yes. You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, just a quick question.
Sure.
Lots of Sephardic Jews have the last name Behar, which I don't know if you know that or not. Is it just a coincidence, or that's the way that they identify themselves by Mount Sinai or whatever it is? I'm just curious how that originated.
I don't know. You have to also know if it could be it's in the language. I don't know if it's coming from the Hebrew word or if it comes from a different language. But if it originates from the Hebrew word, it may very well be from the Bahar, from the mountain.
Yeah, that must be it. Yeah. Okay, just curious because lots of Sephardic Jews have that last name. Yeah.
Interesting.
Thank you. Sorry for interfering.
Sure. So the second parsha is Bechukosai, which means in my laws. We are going to focus on the second parsha of this week, which is also the last book, the last Torah portion of the book of Vayikra, where a large portion of this week's of the parsha discusses reward and punishment. It's the parsha the opening verses say that if you follow my mitzvot, if you go in my ways, in the ways of the mitzvot, and you study the Torah, you toil in Torah, so then I would give you the rain in its proper time, peace. You would be successful in general, successful in wars. And then it continues that if you do not follow my ways, then I'll punish you. And also list pretty much the opposite of the blessings. There won't be there won't be rain in the proper time. There won't be peace. There won't be success in the nation, exile. We won't be in the land. We'll be exiled from the land of Israel, etc. So that's a large portion of this week's parsha, which is pretty much listing reward and punishment, which is a very central part of Judaism, of religion. That there's certain actions that we're supposed to do. There's certain obligations that we have towards Hashem, and we have the choice to do them or not to do them. And there's also a reward and punishment system sort of to balance things out. But when we look at the reward and also the punishment that's in this week's parsha, we see something very interesting. All the rewards that are listed are all physical rewards. They are all very materialistic, physical things that are going to happen: rain, peace. People won't start war with you. If someone does, you'll win. All very physical rewards. Now we know that in addition to the physical rewards, the Torah also tells us, indicates in a few places, and the rabbis expand on it, that is a spiritual reward. Our neshama, our soul, is everlasting. And after it departs our body, it goes to, you could call it heaven, you could call it Gan Eden. And there's also a system, there's a spiritual reward and punishment for the soul. So it's very interesting that the Torah, when it tells us the rewards, it only speaks in this week's parsha and many other places, it only speaks about physical reward. So there are indications for the spiritual reward, but it's fair to say that the majority of verses that are clearly speaking about reward, it speaks about physical reward. Almost all the verses in our Torah portion, and the majority in the whole Torah is also speaking about physical reward, which is kind of strange. The difference between physical reward and spiritual reward is a huge difference, and I think we could all agree on the idea that spiritual reward is much higher and much more special and much more special than physical reward. No, it's like when a kid does a job, I don't know, he cleans his room. So you give him a few candies. But when you give your car into the mechanic, you don't pay the person with candies, you pay him with money. Even though when he was a child, yes, a reward for him was candy, but when he grew up and now money is what's dear to him and money is what's meaningful. So now money is the reward. And if you give him candy, he'll think you're making a joke out of him. And the truth is you probably are making a joke out of him. So same too, someone who really appreciates spiritual reward and really understands it and appreciates it. So telling him physical reward seemingly is, I won't say insulting, but it's degrading. You're like undermining and underestimating the preciousness of Torah. There's the spiritual reward, which is so much higher and so much better than the physical reward. So if that's the case, why is it that the Torah, most of the places where it speaks about reward, it's all about physical reward? It seems kind of strange, out of place. Now, this question is a question that many philosophers, Jewish philosophers, thought about and spoke about and wrote about. And there's many different approaches. The Rabbi Yitzchak Abarbanel, which was a Jewish philosopher which lived from approximately 1437 to 1508, he compiled 7 approaches to this question. And there are more. We're not going to go through all the possible approaches. But I think it's just important to note that when it comes to these type of discussions, philosophical discussions, there could be a number of approaches, and they could be, and sometimes one approach would be more meaningful, or one approach would be more resonate with us than the other, which is fine. And we're also not trying to give, the whole picture of and the ultimate possible answer, because when it comes to philosophical discussions which don't really impact the practical day-to-day life, it's okay to have different approaches, different thoughts, as long as it's not going against the foundations of what the Torah is built on. So like over here, we have a philosophical question: why does the Torah primarily focus on the physical reward? With like, we're going to see a number of approaches, and some of the approaches we might like better, some of the approaches might be clearer to us, which is okay, as we'll see soon. That's just my introduction before we get into the answers, that it's okay to have these different, if one answer you feel is better than the other, in our, or we feel more comfortable with than the other. All right, so one approach, which is the approach of the Rambam, Maimonides. The Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, a very famous Jewish philosopher and writer. He wrote the Mishnah Torah. He compiled all of the laws of the Torah in a very ordinary fashion. It's almost fair to say that he is the first to compile everything in the ordinary fashion. It wasn't done so often. It wasn't really done before him. People compiled different books of laws, but to compile everything in an ordinary fashion, he was definitely unique. And he sort of started a new phase with his book of the Mishnah Torah. And he also compiled many books. He also compiled a book on Jewish thought, which is called Moreh Nevuchim, known as the Guide for the Perplexed. And so he was like he was big halachicist. He wrote on halacha, Jewish law, and he also wrote in philosophy. So he has a very unique approach when it comes to understanding the reward and punishment which is listed in Torah. We will read what he says inside in a moment, like we did in the past weeks. We read some text inside. He makes his argument in a very unique way. It's a little bit long, but we'll read it together and then we will discuss it. So like what I did last week, I'm going to share the screen. I'm first going to...
Can I say something
Sure.
short?
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to say, in my opinion,
Yeah.
because if we follow the mitzvot, the ruchanit of us is already okay.
The what?
So all we need help with is the physical. And that way the rewards would be physical. The
Interesting.
rewards are physical because the ruchaniyut of us is already okay.
Right. So when you say the
We don't need
ruchaniyut,
help if we do the mitzvot. We don't need help with that.
right. So this is a very good point what you're making.
Doing the mitzvot, the ruchaniyut means
Yeah.
it's healthy. The ruchaniyut is healthy.
Right. So the point you're making is a very good point. This actually touches upon the point that the Rambam is about to make. Maimonides is going to make. We're about to read. But regarding the ruchaniyut being okay, there's two aspects here.
Okay.
There's the aspect. You're seeing the Rambam is going to say something very similar to what you're saying. But when you say the spiritual is okay, there's two aspects here. There's the aspect of our spiritual connection with Hashem, with God being okay, but then there's a spiritual reward. The fact that we would have a share in the world to come, which is speaking about the future, not the present. So our question is, why doesn't the Torah speak about the future spiritual reward, which we know is going to be, and it only speaks about, or primarily speaks about, the physical reward? Okay. So we're going to start with reading the Rambam together. I'm going to bring it up, pull it up on the screen. So somewhat a long quote, but we'll read it together. The Rambam, right before this section, he spoke about the world to come and how the ultimate reward is for the soul, that when the soul that would merit to have a share in the world to come. And then he continues as following. Now, after it is known that the reward and the good which we will acquire for observing the precepts and the way of God, according to what is written in the Torah, consists of life in the world to come. What is this which it is written throughout the Torah and also in this week's parsha? If you observe, you acquire such and such. If you do not observe, such and such will happen to you. For instance, plenty, famine, war, peace, oppression, permanency in the land, exile, success in undertakings, its failure, and other similar texts in the Torah where the Torah promises us physical reward and punishment. The Rambam says we just finished learning that the main reward is the spiritual reward, that our souls will have a share in the world to come. So why is it that the Torah is telling us all these physical promises? In other words, where does it fit on the map? Where does it fit so to speak, in the picture of reward, the physical rewards. So here he makes a very interesting argument. All those things were and will be true. And as long as we observe the precepts of the Torah, all the good of this world will overtake us. And as long as we transgress them, we'll be met by all those evil things described therein. Nevertheless, neither are those good things, the physical good things, the end of the reward for observing the commandments, nor are those evil things the end of the punishment to be inflicted upon those who violate the precepts. We were assured in the Torah that if we will observe it in joy and out of goodness of our soul, of our heart, and constantly study its wisdom, he will remove from us all such things which prevent us from observing it, such as sickness, war, famine, and the like. What the Torah is telling us here is not a reward. What the Torah is telling us here is that Hashem would remove obstacles from observing the Torah. He will remove all the obstacles which prevent us from fulfilling it. For example, sickness, war, famine, and the like. He will, in addition, grant us by giving us all good which sustain our hands to observe the Torah, such as plenty, peace, and an increase in silver and gold, so that we be not occupied all of our days in the things that are bodily needs, but instead we'll be able to study its wisdom, observe the precepts in order to acquire life to the world to come. So what the Rambam here is saying is a very interesting idea, that there are, just like, we'll give an example. For example, let's say you hire a worker. You hire someone to work for you. So in the contract, there are two portions of the contract. One portion is the reward, the payment. When you finish doing, there could be a contractor that is paid by the hour, so the worker could be paid every hour. You'll get a certain amount of money, and I'll pay you by the end of the week, or the end of the month, or the end of the year. Or it could be by the job, that when you complete the job, I will pay you for this job, reward you for the job. So that's one part of the contract. But then there's another part of the contract. Certain things that you give the worker in order for him to work. For example, part of the contract could be to give him an office with an air conditioner and heating system that he should be able to work comfortably. Part of the contract could be, if let's say he's doing deliveries, or he needs to travel for the work, whatever it might be, so you give him a car or a truck to drive around with. Part of the contract could be to maybe give him a cell phone if he needs it for the work. Those are not rewards. Those are a portion of the contract which is just enabling him to work properly. So again, so there's two parts of the contract. There's two parts of this person, so to speak, reward. He could look at, I have a comfortable place to work. Sometimes it could be lunch. I have lunch every day. I have a car. He could look at those things as reward, but in truth, that's not his payment. That's just things to make him comfortable and give him the ability to work. His reward or his payment comes by the end. When he finishes whatever they made up, when he finishes a certain amount of time, or when he finishes the undertaking, the job that he undertook, that he took upon himself. So that's exactly what the Rambam says. The same thing, these two aspects are also true in Hashem's, so to speak, contract with us. He says there are two parts of my contract with you. One part is the reward, which is totally a spiritual reward, which would apply to the soul in the world to come, or when Mashiach comes. But that's a spiritual reward, which is typical, and that is the reward for Torah, which would be paid back by the end of days. Then what we learn in this week's parsha and other Torah portions which is a physical reward. That's not a reward as a payment. That's just removing obstacles, giving the ability to those that follow the ways of the Torah, the ability to continue following the ways of the Torah, the ability to continue studying Torah, the ability to continue learning, to continue keeping the mitzvot, and not have to be distracted by bodily needs, by worries, by weaknesses, by sicknesses. If we think about this, this is in a certain sense a revolutionary look on these Torah portions. If you ask the Rambam, this week's parsha, is there reward in this week's parsha? He'll answer, no, that's not a reward. What is discussed in this week's Torah portion is what you could call the working agreements. That's just an agreement that if you follow and you qualify, I'll make it easier for you to work, easier for you, which in our case is do the Torah and mitzvot. But it's not the reward. The reward is only a spiritual reward. So if we go back to our original question, why does the Torah only specify physical reward? The Rambam's answer would be, it doesn't, because it's not reward. That's just part of the contract. That's just the working agreement to make it easier for us to work, to remove the obstacles, but not a reward, which would be a purely spiritual reward. So that's the Rambam's take. There are those that argue with him, and they don't accept this approach, as we'll see soon. But that's the first approach, which answers the question, it addresses the question, and it definitely is a unique approach. Just to add one point to this approach, okay, so what so what that the Torah is telling us the agreement, the working agreement, so to speak. But why doesn't it also tell us about the spiritual reward? Why can it tell us about both? Why can it say both equally? Why does it primarily focus on the physical, according to the Rambam, workers agreement, not the spiritual reward? So on that, the Rambam is going to say that the Torah wants us to work more to serve Hashem in a pure manner, to serve Hashem with pure intention, not in order to get rewarded. Meaning that we should serve him purely for his sake, not for the sake of any external motivations. And therefore it doesn't want to discuss the reward, because there is reward, but it wants to keep the reward not the focus. On the other hand, removing obstacles from studying Torah, which is not a reward, which is just the ability to be able to practice the Torah and mitzvot, so that Hashem tells us in the Torah. Which this is also a little bit of a, so to speak, a bump in this approach, because true, it's very nice, someone who could serve Hashem and do the Torah mitzvot purely with a pure motivation, just for the sake of Hashem, without any other motivations. But not everyone is holding by that level, as we'll speak a little bit more later. So why doesn't the Torah at least address a little bit for those people that are not holding by this high level, which probably may very well be most people? But despite the small bumps in this approach, but it definitely answers the question that the Torah is not speaking about reward; it's speaking about the working, so to speak, the agreement, the working agreement, not the reward, the payment, which is a spiritual reward. However, so that's approach number one. However, there are many Jewish philosophers that disagree, and they And they hold that the Torah is telling us a reward. The Torah is speaking about a reward. But so if that's the case, why doesn't it speak about the spiritual reward? Why does it only, and according to them, there's a spiritual reward and a physical reward. It's not a contradiction. So if that's the case, why doesn't it also speak about the spiritual reward? So one unique approach, which I think would also shed some light on the general concept of reward and punishment, and the rewards that the Torah discusses in this week's Torah portion, is from Rabbi Yosef Albo. He authored a book called the Sefer HaIkrim, which could be translated the Book of Roots or Principles, and he discusses many of the principles and many of the principles which are the core principles and sort of the roots of the Jewish belief. He lived from the year 1380 till 1444 approximately. So he is similar, around the same time as the Barbanel that we mentioned in the beginning of this class. He says a very interesting, so his idea that he says is the following. There, as we spoke already, there's spiritual reward and there's physical reward. So he says, the physical reward is given to the community as a whole, the Jewish nation as a whole. The spiritual reward is given to each person on a particular basis, on his own personal merit. And he says it has to be this way. It makes a very interesting argument. Let's take a look at the rewards that are mentioned in this week's Torah portion. Rain being in its proper time, the peace. Jews would be settled in the land of Israel, not in exile. All these things, and same thing, the curses which are the opposite of this. All these things are applicable to the nation as a whole, to the Jewish nation as a whole. It doesn't make sense that it will rain in one person's backyard and someone else it won't rain in their backyard. Right? That would be an open miracle, and that would automatically take away free choice. Obviously, the reward and punishment is not cannot be in a way that it's a direct cause and result of our actions. There has to be somewhat a delayed effect or a more general effect, because if it would be a direct cause, then there won't be any free choice. If every time I do something wrong, I'll see right away the consequence. I do something right, I'll see the reward. So then I'll automatically do what's right. And that would sort of strip me from any free choice, which is a fundamental principle that Hashem wants us to have. So therefore, therefore all the rewards that are discussed in this week's Torah portion, all the physical rewards, is for this nation as a whole. Now, when you're dealing with the nation as a whole, it could be if most of the nation is righteous and deserving, even if there's a minority that's not deserving, they may very well receive the reward together with everyone else. For example, if most of the nations are deserving of rain in its proper time without any delays, so even if there's a minority, let's say 2-3%, which is not deserving that, they probably will also benefit from the rain, right? The rain, it's not like the rain in everyone's backyard besides their backyard, and it's not like they won't be able to get the vegetables that grow from that rain. So at the same time, when we're speaking about peace. So if there won't be wars there won't be wars in the land of Israel. It won't be. Everyone would benefit from the peace that there is in the land of Israel. So the physical rewards, are granted to the nation as a whole. The physical reward, the spiritual rewards, goes by a one-by-one basis, by a particular basis, individual basis, which also makes sense. It doesn't make sense to say that if let's say out of 100 people, 99 people are righteous and they deserve the world to come. So therefore, that 100th person, that one person should also tag along. Either you deserve it or you don't deserve it. So he says this is a very interesting argument that physical reward, the reward that's discussed in the Torah portions openly, where the Torah is speaking to the whole nation as a whole. So therefore, wants to discuss the reward that also pertains to the whole nation. So speaking the physical reward, which automatically, which is given to the nation as a whole. The spiritual reward, which is individualized, because if it's not individualized, that would not be a fair judgment. It's only fair that should be individualized. So then that reward is given to each person individually. And the Torah doesn't speak about it because the Torah is focused and wants to speak primarily about the reward that pertains to the nation as a whole. This approach, which I find very interesting and definitely a unique approach, which I think may also answer some questions like, why don't we see the reward that is discussed in this week's parsha? And the answer is because the reward that's discussed in this week's Torah portion is speaking to the nation as a whole. So now that we're in exile, so obviously that means, since we're in Galut, in exile, that means we still have what to fix. So therefore, not deserving for that reward that is given to the nation, to the Jewish nation as a whole. However, the spiritual reward, which is a one-by-one basis, and also based on how much I deserve, that's how much a person deserves. That's how much a person would get. So that it doesn't speak about this week's parsha, and that is true. So obviously, just going back to our question, the question that we opened up the class with, the answer to the question according to this approach is that the reason why the Torah speaks about the physical reward, because the Torah wants to speak about the reward that has to do with the nation as a whole. Right? So that's another approach. That's the second approach. So even though this week's parsha, not like the Rambam, Maimonides, that says that this week's Torah portion is not reward, it's just, so to speak, the agreement that in order to enable us to keep Torah properly, according to this approach, it is reward. But there are two types of rewards. And this type is a type that's to do with the nation as a whole, which is a physical reward, and the spiritual reward, which is on an individual basis, based on individual merit, is not discussed in this week's parsha. Right. So that's a second approach. So far, is everything clear before we move on to a third and fourth approach? Anyone has any questions?
Yes, I just joined late, unfortunately, but I missed the original question. Would you mind repeating it?
Sure. So the original question that we asked in the beginning of this class was that this week's Torah portion discusses reward and punishment. We find something interesting, that the reward that is discussed is primarily physical reward in this week's Torah portion. And the question is, we know that there's also spiritual reward. We know that there's also there is the world to come and Gan Eden, which there will be a spiritual reward for our souls. So why doesn't the Torah speak about in this week's Torah portion the spiritual reward? And it's not only a question for this week's Torah portion, it's also in general in Torah, the main focus is always on the physical reward, not so much on the spiritual. So that's a question. Why is the focus on the physical reward? Seemingly, The spiritual reward is much higher and much more precious, and so to speak, a much better reward than the physical. Right?
Thank you.
Welcome. You're welcome. All right. So now, another approach.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Sure.
Who was the proponent of the second approach, or are we just listing them?
So the second approach, his name was Rabbi Joseph Albel.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Thank you.
A third approach is, we sort of hinted to it earlier, which could be that there are most people, or a large portion of people, don't really appreciate spiritual reward. It doesn't talk to them. That's not the type of reward that talks to them. The type of reward that talks to them is a physical reward, right? Just like if we go back to our example, a child appreciates candies. An adult appreciates as a reward money. So same too, when we're serving Hashem, we also, most of us appreciate physical things. We're not holding by that high level of appreciating and really understanding the spiritual reward. So the Torah wants to be very practical. So therefore it focuses on the physical reward, because that's something that's more practical, more relatable, and more meaningful for most of us, and at least for a large portion. True, it's very nice if there's someone that can serve Hashem, not for the sake of reward, not for the sake of a physical reward, not for the sake of a spiritual reward, or at least not for a physical reward. True, that's a very high level. And when we meet such a person, we really appreciate it. We appreciate them, appreciate that they're serving Hashem in such a way, and they don't even have reward in mind. But most people are not holding by the level. So being that Torah wants to be practical and down to earth, so it speaks and focuses on the physical reward. Which this approach, which is true, falls short of properly answering the question, because, okay, true, even if we assume, which would not be safe to assume, that the majority of people appreciate and only relate to physical reward, but what about the minority? What about those people that the physical reward doesn't mean so much to them, and their main focus is on a spiritual reward? And more than that, to make this question a little stronger, we will share an interesting idea on the opening words, a Hasidic thought on the opening words of this week's Torah portion, which is in Bechukosai telechu. If you would go in my ways and you follow my commandments. The word Bechukosai, name of this week's Torah portion, which literally means commandments, can also indicate and has similar letters to the word chakika. It shares some of the same Hebrew letters, these two words. The word chakika means engraving, right? So we have Bechukosai, which is the opening word of this week's Torah portion, and we have the word chakika, which means engraving, and these two, which we could understand as meaning that we're speaking here about someone that follows the way the Torah way, follows the Hashem's commandments in a way that is engraved in his soul. Which means the following. What's the difference between something that's written, let's say, with ink on a parchment, something you wrote, you took a pen and you wrote on a piece of paper, or something which is engraved and etched into a stone? The difference, I think, is pretty open. When you wrote with ink on a paper, the ink is an entity for itself, and the paper is an entity for itself. You took some ink and you wrote on a paper. So you brought together these two entities, and now it's written on a paper, and it's very hard to separate between the two. But in the end of the day, there are two entities here. There's the ink and there's the paper. When something is engraved in a stone, there is nothing here besides the stone. The only thing here is the stone, and the stone itself, and maybe the lack of stone itself, where the part of the stone that you engraved, that you etched out, the lack of stone reads a certain inscript. You inscripted it, it reads a certain paragraph, but the words that you're reading, that you see, are made up of the stone itself. There is nothing here besides the stone. So what the Torah is indicating here is that we're speaking here about someone that is Bechukosai, that he's following the laws, the Bechukosai, the Chukim, in a way of Chakika, in a way that it's engraved in his soul. It's engraved in him, as if to say that he is so one with his purpose and what he's doing, that he feels like he's not an entity for himself. His whole entity is just for one purpose: to serve his creator. Now, this is a level which is a very high level. Usually we have our personal lives and we also serve Hashem and we do what we want from him, what he wants from us. But we can't, most people can't say that the way our performance of the Torah is as if it's engraved in us. And there's nothing in us besides the performance of Torah. Now, however, it's such a level. And if this is the level that the Torah is speaking about, the level of someone that is performing the Torah mitzvot in a way that is engraved in him, so how could it be that for such a person that is, so to speak, totally lost in his mission, totally lost in his service to his creator, to such a person, Hashem is promising physical reward? This only makes the question stronger. In other words, earlier we said, okay, maybe the physical reward is for the majority of people that are not holding by a very high level of service of Hashem, and what's relatable to them is only physical reward. However, we see clearly, so then we have the question, what about the minority? What about those people that they do appreciate the spiritual reward? And now it's strengthening that question. Then not only what about them, it seems that it may very well be that the Torah person is actually speaking particularly, or according to some interpretations, particularly to such people, to this minority of people that are totally engaged in just doing Torah and mitzvot, which is very high level. So then, why to these people does the Torah promise the physical reward? So to explain this, the Rebbe offers a very unique explanation to the general question: why is it so important to have physical reward? Why can't there just be spiritual reward? It says, just imagine someone who's happy, someone who's excited. When do you know that this person is truly excited? When he dances, when he claps, when he sings. when do you see that a certain emotion really was really penetrated and really was brought into our consciousness is when it expresses in a physical manner. There are many ideas that go through our head and many different, sometimes different emotions. And sometimes we could try to, bring ourselves to feel a certain way, to appreciate something, a certain idea. So how do I know? What is the test? How do I know if this idea, if this emotion, or if this concept really penetrated me and really and really took me to the, and really, so to speak, took me over to the core, and I changed because of it. And it's not just a superficial imagination or thinking or excitement. What is the test? What is the way to what is the, so to speak, the measuring stick? How can we measure if it really entered our concept, if it really entered our, if it really became part of us? By seeing if it affects our action, if it affects us in a very physical way, in a very practical way. So in our example of someone who's excited, I could be happy about things. I could be maybe up, my spirit could be uplifted about certain things. But when I actually feel the excitement, and especially when I feel that I have to express it in, in singing and clapping and dancing, so that shows that it really took me through and through. So just like this is true regarding our emotions, the same too is true also when we're speaking in regarding our reward, the reward for Torah and mitzvot. The objective of creation is to take down the boundary between spiritual and physical. That's the objective of Hashem's giving us the Torah. To connect the way we see it, the way it is on its, in its natural way, the physical and the spiritual are very different and disconnected from one another. One of the primary purposes of creation is to take down that boundary, take down that divider, that divide between the spiritual and the physical. Now, if the reward for Torah would only be a spiritual reward, that would mean that the Torah is only a spiritual idea, meaning for spiritual actions, you get a spiritual reward. And that would sort of indicate that the Torah never affected the physical world, never affected our physical being, and in the world in large, never affected the physical world. So therefore, it is very important that the Torah's the reward for the Torah is not just a spiritual reward, but rather also a physical reward, which shows us that the Torah is not just something which is a spiritual service and has nothing to do with the practical physical world, but rather on the contrary. The reward for the Torah is a physical reward because the service of Torah is something that should be engraved in our being. And through that, the reward would also be a physical reward. So in a certain sense, what is the indicator that the Torah really is not just a physical service, but is a service that indicates that someone reached the level that the Torah is engraved in his being, and he's one with it, is when the reward is also a physical reward, meaning it's not stuck, so to speak, in its spiritual realm. It also penetrates the physical world. Now, this idea is it's a very deep concept and a very profound concept, if we think about it. But it also brings us, it gives us an appreciation to the spiritual reward. Up until now, we're like viewing it as the Torah, and then there's also the reward, a spiritual reward, a physical reward. But here, the Rebbe is sort of looking at it from a much deeper angle, that the reward that's a result of the Torah is because the physical reward that's a result of the Torah is because the Torah doesn't stay in a spiritual realm, but rather penetrates the physical world. And this is a very important idea, because this is actually the purpose of the giving of the Torah, that the Torah is able to penetrate and affect even the physical world, and doesn't just stay, so to speak, stuck in a spiritual realm. And that's why the Torah discusses so much the physical reward, because that is an intrinsic part of an indicator of the truth of how Torah penetrates this world. In other words, it's not just, if it's just reward, so there's better reward, the spiritual reward maybe is better. But we're saying no, the physical reward is not just about the reward. It's also an indicator how unique it is that the reward for a spiritual Torah is a physical reward. Why? Because Torah is something that penetrates our physical existence and also and affects our physical life, which I think is a very powerful idea. Which could be viewed on a much broader sense, how Torah and the physical world and our physical life shouldn't be separated. We shouldn't view it as two separate entities, and sometimes I have my physical life and I have my spiritual life, and I'm sort of dual personality. Sometimes I do this, sometimes I do that. No, that we should try to bridge that gap and connect the two to the best of our ability, which is expressed in the idea that the reward for the spiritual Torah is a physical reward. Is this idea clear?
Yes, Rabbi. The idea is we're actually elevating the physical by its having been penetrated by the spiritual concept behind our action.
Exactly.
It infuses it with a deeper meaning.
That's true. That's the idea. So yeah, thank you. So just to summarize what we spoke today, we started off with the question why most of this week's parsha discusses physical reward, if there's also spiritual reward. And seemingly the focus should be on the spiritual reward. And we spoke 4 approaches. The first approach was the Rambam's, that the Torah never discusses reward. The Torah is discussing and giving, and what the Torah is discussing is just the ability that we should be able to work and serve Hashem in peace. The reward will come after. So if we follow the ways of the Torah, so then He will also help us to continue following His ways. Hashem will help us to continue following His ways. That's the first approach, the approach of the Rambam. The second approach was Rabbi Yosef Albo, that said there are 2 types of reward. There's the individual reward and the communal reward. And the physical reward is the communal reward. The spiritual reward is the individual reward. And therefore, what the Torah, which is in this week's Torah portion, which is primarily speaking to the community as a whole, to the nation as a whole, so therefore speaking about the physical reward. And like we said, that the physical reward has to be on a communal level, the physical reward, because if it rains, everyone is going to benefit from it. If it rains on time, or if there's peace in the land. And the spiritual reward has to work on an individual basis. It doesn't make sense that just because my neighbor was righteous, I could do what I want, and then also have a share in the world to come. So the physical reward has to be individual, has to be communalized, and the spiritual reward has to be individual. The third approach was that the Torah just speaking to people, to a larger majority of the nation that doesn't appreciate spiritual reward. So Torah wants to be practical, more down to earth, and therefore it says it's the physical reward. And then there's the fourth approach, which is that what the Torah is trying to indicate to us is that the reward for Torah is not just a spiritual reward. It doesn't stay, so to speak, stuck in a spiritual realm, but rather it also affects the physical world. And the reason for that is because the cause of that is that our keeping of the Torah should also be in a way that we shouldn't separate between our physical life and our spiritual life, but rather we should let our physical life be engraved and penetrated by the spiritual, by the Torah, and therefore the physical reward is actually indicating a very profound idea that the spiritual Torah is connected and penetrates and affects the physical world. So that was the four approaches we spoke. Right. With that we'll conclude.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Did it indicate proponents of the third
Realize,
and the fourth approach in terms of their names? I mean, which Rebbeim?
Oh, who said it?
Oh,
Yeah.
it's
Right.
Abraham, but it's up there as Kir. Okay.
I can't hear you.
So the third,
The last one, about the Torah influences the
yeah.
spiritual stuff.
So
What-
say this. What?
One of the liberating concept I realized, and it came through physical stresses, physical challenges,
Yeah.
was the spiritual controls the physical.
Right.
And it's very sometimes hard to grasp that because we're physical beings and we have senses and everything like that, and everything is focused on survival, basically, in a very sophisticated way today. And when I realized
like
that,
the
it
third
was
approach.
absolutely liberating because I could now look at the balance you're saying.
Right.
One wasn't all spiritual, one wasn't all physical.
Right.
So I think that touches into the last one you said,
Right. Thank
Torah.
you. Yeah, it really does.
But I just wanted to know the names of the two
Yeah.
Rebbeim.
Yeah. Sure. So the third approach was the Even Ezra says it, the Ibn Ezra, and some other commentaries. Abarbanel actually quotes it from him. Rabbi Yitzchak Abarbanel quotes it from the Even Ezra.
Yes.
And the fourth approach is the present Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He says he expanded on the fourth approach.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, so guess we'll see everyone next week, next Wednesday, and we'll speak next week's parsha, God willing.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everyone.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.